Welcome to the first episode of Turning Points, GCERF's first podcast series on the rehabilitation and reintegration of returnees from northeast Syria. My name is Lilla Schumicky-Logan, and I work as the Deputy Executive Director and the Head of Portfolio Management at the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, GCERF. GCERF is the only global fund to prevent violent extremism and terrorism. Preventing violent extremism is not only about stopping people from being drawn in, it is also about the turning point and what happens after. What happens to those who were drawn in or who were caught up in it through no choice of their own? What happens to the women, to the children, to the families trying to find their way back home, trying to reclaim legitimacy within their communities? That process of helping people return, heal, and rebuild their life is called rehabilitation and reintegration. And it is one of the most important steps towards building a positive future. Today, I am joined by two colleagues who bring years of direct, hands-on experience in this space. Mr. Hatem Shatnawi is GCERF's regional manager overseeing our programs in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and Mr. Tariq Hassan, GCERF's national advisor for Iraq. Between them, they have worked closely with governments, communities, and families navigating some of the most complex and painful situations you can imagine. Welcome, both of you. Now, before we get into what rehabilitation and reintegration actually looks like in practice, we need to understand the situation that makes it so important and urgent. And I want to start on the ground, because I think for many people listening, the scale of what we are talking about is not fully understood, and once you hear it, it is very hard to look away. Hatem, please paint us a picture. When we talk about the camps in northeast Syria or the communities in northeast Syria, what are we actually talking about? Who are these people? Why are they there? How did they get there?
Thank you, Lilla, for having me today. To understand what these camps are and who is in this camp, we need to go back a decade. In 2014, a group called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as Daesh, declared what is called a caliphate across part of Iraq and Syria. At its peak, it controlled roughly a third of Syria and 40% of Iraq. Millions of people lived under its rule. More than 40,000 individuals from over 80 countries are estimated to have traveled to Iraq and Syria between 2011-2016 to join ISIS. They were drawn by ideology, by propaganda, by false feeling of belonging, or by false sense of purpose. But many of them did not come alone. They brought with them their wives, their children, their families. And in many cases, women had little or no say in that decision. In 2019, the so-called ISIS caliphate has collapsed. When the caliphate fell, thousands of people, former fighters, but majority their family member and children, ended up in displacement camp in northeast Syria. And many of them had been there ever since. As of last year, around 20,000 people remained in the camps in northeast Syria. Approximately 2/3 of them are children. They come from countries across Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, and thousands of them have no formal documentation, no birth certificate, no passport, no proof of who they are and where they belong. In the eyes of states and legal system, they do not exist.
So, Hatem, you're saying that most of these families, women and children who had little or no say in any of these have ended up in camps. What has life been like for the people inside these camps?
Overcrowded, limited healthcare, limited education opportunity for children, fragile security, and in some parts of the camp, extremist network continued to operate, enforcing their own norms, intimidating the resident, and in some cases carrying out violence. And then there are the children. Think about this for a moment. A child born in the camp has never seen a functional city, never attended a proper school, never had consistent access to medical care. Some of these children have never even seen a tree. It tells you everything about the kind of childhood, the kind of future that is being shaped inside these fences.
I think this is extremely important to our listeners to really understand that thousands of children growing up without identity, with very limited education, with very limited stability. And this is not something that you can easily move past. Thank you, Hatem, for painting a vivid picture of what these camps are and were. The situation in the camps has not always been static, as we know. There have been significant developments in the recent months. Movements of people, shifts in control, families leaving without authorization or support, attempting to return to their communities, or being transferred, or settling down in a third community in some other parts of northeast or northwest Syria. Can you tell our listener what is happening on the ground as of today, April 2026?
In February 2026, the Syrian government took the control of Al-Hol camp from Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, who had been administrating the camp. Shortly after, residents were transferred to a newly established camp called Ak Burhan, estimated to hold now around 6,000 people. And later, Al-Hol was officially closed. But the transition was not clean. Reports indicate there were mass departure, people living without authorization or support in the hours before Syrian government took control. Roughly 12 hours gap during which thousands of people moved without any coordinated process in place. Where they went, under which condition, remain largely unknown. The future remain uncertain. Some countries have started bringing back women and children only, but many remain trapped. The result is a situation that many in this field describe, and I think accurately, as ticking time bomb. Not only humanitarian crisis, but long-term security threat, because without proper rehabilitation and integration, without education opportunity, without stability, without legal identity, the conditions that produce the next cycle of radicalization are being built quietly every single day. The camp may have closed, but the crisis has not.
You mentioned a ticking time bomb. Let's sink in for a moment. These camps are in Syria, but so why should someone sitting in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in Jakarta, in Indonesia, or in Bishkek, in Kyrgyzstan, care about what happens in Syria?
The simple truth is that this was not and never just a Syrian problem. The people in this camp came from over 80 countries: Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia. Someone in Washington or Berlin or in Jakarta should care because in many cases they are their citizens, their nationals. This is a global crisis, global issue, and it demands a global response. But let me go beyond the legal argument, because even if you set aside citizenship, the security argument stands on its own. Think about what we have just described. These are precisely the conditions that produce radicalization.
Thank you, Hatem. You really brought reality to us and to the listeners. So we have a situation where tens of thousands of people, the majority of them are women and children, are either still in this new camp, Ak Burhan or Aroj, or left without hardly any support that they need actually to rebuild their lives. And I believe that this is where rehabilitation and reintegration comes in. Tariq, Thank you for being here. Could you please tell us, for our listeners who are hearing these words for the first time, what does rehabilitation and reintegration actually mean in a plain, simple language so my granny can also understand it?
Thank you, Lilla, for having me here. It's worth pausing on those two words because they are at the heart of everything we're going to discuss in this podcast series. So let me try to bring them to life. Rehabilitation and reintegration, at their simplest, it means helping people rebuild their lives after they have been affected by conflict or exposed to extremist environments. It's also supporting communities to accept them back safely. The rehabilitation focuses on the person, on the individual. It's about addressing the trauma of this individual, providing, for example, psychological care and support, filling the education gaps, building the personal skills, or helping someone process what they have been through and find a pathway forward. Reintegration is the next level. It's about reconnecting that individual with the family, the community, their society, finding work, rebuilding the trust, becoming, over time, of course, and with support, an accepted, functioning member of the world they left or were taken from. If I may concrete this with an example, imagine a young boy returning from a camp in northeast Syria. This boy has missed years of school, experienced things no child should ever experience, and he's returning to a community that look at him with suspicion. The community is not sure what he has been exposed to, and also the community is not sure whether to welcome this boy or fear him. In this case, a holistic rehabilitation and reintegration program would work on two tracks simultaneously. On one side, it would support him with education, psychosocial care, perhaps even a vocational training if he gets older, what we said about personal skills development. On the other side, it would work with his family and with the society and the community through dialogue, mediation, awareness raising to reduce the stigma. Also to rebuild the trust between the community and that individual in both ways and create the conditions for him to actually belong somewhere again. It's not just about helping an individual, it's actually about healing the relationship between that individual and the society. And that, by its very nature, is a long-term holistic process. It cannot be rushed, and of course it cannot be done on the cheap. And it's also important to understand that it cannot succeed if only one side of the equation is addressed. You cannot reintegrate someone into a community that's not ready to receive them. And of course you cannot sustain rehabilitation without a life worth coming back to. So in general, this is what R&R means in practice, and that's why it matters.
Is there actually evidence that this works, that rehabilitation and reintegration works? What does the evidence from GCERF funded programs show us?
If I may start with our own program in Iraq, we call it the Return with Hope program. The program was implemented across 3 governorates, Ninawa, Anbar, and Salahuddin, on a period of 2 years. It was addressed for supporting the returnees from Al-Hol, combining psychosocial support, education, case management, and community dialogue. And what the independent evaluation found is genuinely encouraging. For the education support for the children, 90% of caregivers said that this support improved school-related outcomes for the returnee children. For the MHBSS, mental health and psychosocial support, this activity is actually helping women to heal, while 70% of those women reported that this MHBSS support contributed in improving their emotional well-being, coping capacity, and perceived safety in their communities. And we see similar patterns across regions. In Albania, for instance, 83% of returnees supported through the GCERF program reported feeling accepted by the communities. In Kosovo, we have 92% of the mothers said that their children felt safe and positive at school. These are not small numbers. These are families that were given a chance and took it. And critically, where programs have been implemented holistically and sustained over time, we have seen 0 cases of recidivism. The question was never whether this works. The question is whether we are willing to invest in it at the scale it deserves.
Clearly, rehabilitation and reintegration works, as you have outlined and supported and backed with concrete numbers. Yet despite that evidence, we are still talking about thousands of people remaining in a limbo. What are the biggest obstacles to making rehabilitation and reintegration happen at scale? And what are the few key lessons that could be shared with our audience?
We have the evidence, we have the tools, we have organizations, CSOs, and partners on the ground who know how to do this work. Yet what's happening is limited. There are actually a few obstacles. The first is the funding and political will. As we said, rehabilitation and reintegration is a long-term process. It takes years, not months, but funding cycles are typically short and political priorities shift. For instance, governments that were committed to repatriation last year are facing different pressures this year. And the people in the middle, the families, the frontline workers, the civil society organizations are trying to hold programs together. The second obstacle is legal and administrative complexity. Documentation alone, for instance, birth certificates, nationality papers, legal status, can take years to resolve. Without the documentation, nothing else actually functions because the families cannot practically prove their existence to the system that meant to help them. The third obstacle is stigma. Communities may fear or reject returnees, which makes reintegration much harder. And then there is a current context, regional instability and economic pressure. People live in camps without any structured support. They are disappearing in the communities or across borders with no follow-up, no documentation, no safety net. These are the cases that fall through the cracks, if we may say.
And so from everything GCERF has seen and learned, what are the lessons? Is there one for policymakers or one donor listening to this today? What do you want them to walk away with? Can you clarify one concrete lesson learned?
First, reintegration must be community-based. You cannot focus only on the individual returning. The community they are returning to must be part of the process from the beginning. Second, economic support is not an optional situation. It's central. People who are psychologically healing but economically desperate are actually vulnerable. And third, the local partners are irreplaceable. For different elements, they understand the context, they have the relationships on both community and governmental level, and they can operate in conditions that international organizations cannot. I think the fourth is the flexibility, which is essential. The programs must adapt to changing realities.
Tariq, thank you so much for your honest reflections and on what works and what stands in the way. We have heard the global picture, but I want to bring this closer to home. How does it impact Iraq and the Iraqi people who have suffered enormously the impact of ISIS?
For Iraq, this is linked to the country's stability and social cohesion. If reintegration is successful, it reduces community tensions, prevents marginalization, and strengthens the trust between citizens and institutions. It also helps the communities move forward rather than remain trapped in cycles of fear and division. But if not done properly, the opposite happens. Stigma increases, grievances deepen, and the local tensions can escalate. Given the current pressure Iraq is facing, economic strain, political uncertainty, and security challenges for sure, investment in rehabilitation and reintegration is preventing the next cycle of instability before it begins. It is ultimately about protecting the resilience of Iraqi society as a whole.
The evidence and lessons are loud and clear. We know it works, and we know it's this way. The path is hard, especially in this context of instability, but not impossible. Before we wrap up, I want to give each of you, Tariq and Hatem, a moment to leave our listeners with one thought. What is the one thing you want them to take away? Tariq, let's start with you and then Hatem.
If there is one thing I would leave our listeners with, it's this. Rehabilitation and reintegration are not just about helping a specific group of people. They are about the kind of society we want to build. At a time when Iraq and the wider region is facing enormous pressure, choosing to invest in reintegration is choosing stability over fear, resilience over resentment, a long-term peace over short-term convenience. It's not the easiest path, but it's the necessary one.
Hatem, what's your final point and your final take for our listeners?
I would say rehabilitation and reintegration must be understood as a comprehensive process that begins with de-radicalization and continue through rehabilitation and reintegration. Too often, it's seen as something that applies only to returnees. However, reintegration, to be truly successful, equal attention must be given to working with the communities, preparing them to receive, to accept, and to support this process. Finally, this is not the responsibility of a single agency or government alone. It requires the coordinated effort and commitment of all stakeholders.
Thank you, Hatem. Thank you, Tariq, for sharing such rich insights. What you have shared today is what needs to be said honestly, loudly, and publicly. To our listeners, what we have covered is really the foundation. The why, the who, and the how. In our next episode, we go one step further into the very first practical stage of this journey. The main question will be, what needs to happen before a single person even leaves a camp to return to their community? If you want to find out the answer, stay tuned for our next episode. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with your friends and colleagues. Talk about rehabilitation and reintegration. Thank you for listening to Turning Points. You can find Turning Points on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and on our website www.gcerf.org. Subscribe to never miss an episode. Thank you.